Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really fascinating stack of sources you sent us. It all revolves around, well, a powerful idea from Nassim Nicholas Taleb's The Black Swan. Our mission here in this deep dive is to sort of unpack these excerpts. We want to help you understand why the unexpected is actually maybe the most important thing to consider, and why our brains, frankly, are often pretty terrible at dealing with it. Think of it as, I guess, a shortcut to being better prepared for, wild ride of life.
That's exactly right. We're going to dive into why standard predictions often fail, uncover some, surprising ways our own minds mislead us, and definitely look at strategies for thriving in a world that seems dominated by these rare, high-impact events.
Okay, let's unpack the central concept then, the
Yeah.
black swan. What exactly is it, and why does Taleb argue we should focus on these rare events, not just the normal stuff we see every day?
Well, what's fascinating here really is the argument that to truly understand something, you actually need to look at the extremes, not the average. The source material defines a black swan as basically three things. It's unpredictable beforehand, it has a massive impact, and then only after it happens, we cook up explanations that make it seem like it was predictable all along.
Ah, the hindsight bias thing?
Exactly. The core idea is that these rare, extreme events are uncertainty itself, and they matter way, way more than the predictable day-to-day fluctuations.
So, okay, we spend all this time analyzing the typical, the average, but the things that really shape history or markets or even our own lives are these weird one-off shocks we just didn't see coming.
Precisely. The sources give some pretty powerful historical examples, like those confident predictions early in a war that it would end in days, and then it drags on for 17 years.
Right. Or the example of people fleeing a conflict thinking it's temporary, they'll be back soon, and decades later, they're still refugees.
Yeah, the material even mentions an uncle who apparently saw this pattern temporary, becoming permanent in others' lives, but completely failed to apply that same lesson to his own situation when the time came.
Which, well, that really highlights the problem, doesn't it? We see history, we even see patterns sometimes, and we still get blindsided. Why are we so bad at learning from these rare events, even when similar things have happened before?
The sources suggest a big part of it is, we mistake a sort of naive observation of the past as something definitive about the future. We get stuck looking backwards. We focus intensely on what has happened, and we assume that kind of defines the limits of what can happen. We basically worry too late, only after the event. The black swan idea teaches us that the absence of evidence for something rare isn't evidence of its absence. You can't just assume it won't happen because it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, here's where it gets, for me, really interesting. The sources bring in this crucial distinction. Two kinds of randomness, Mediocristan and Extremistan. Can you break those down? And why is mixing them up such a huge problem?
Yeah, this is key. Think of them as like two different universes of probability. Mediocristan is the realm where the biggest single event doesn't really change the overall picture much, like human height, the tallest person on the planet. They don't drastically shift the average height for everyone. The source points to professions like plumbers, taxi drivers, even prostitutes as examples. Your income is generally capped. It's non-scalable. There's randomness, sure, but the source calls it mild randomness.
Okay, got it. Mild randomness, like things cluster around an average.
Exactly. Now, Extremistan, that's totally different. That's where one single rare event or one person can dominate the whole picture. It's the realm of scalable outcomes. Think about wealth distribution, book sales, movie success, maybe even stuff like internet fame. One hit like a Da Vinci Code or the Bible, the source uses those examples, can sell vastly more than pretty much all other books combined. It's that winner-take, almost all dynamic.
So the average person or event in Extremistan is almost irrelevant.
Kind of, yeah. Compared to the few massive outliers. This is where you find what the source calls wild randomness.
Okay, so the big problem then is our intuition, our statistics, our everyday mental tools. They're built for Mediocristan, right? But we keep trying to apply them to Extremistan.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
The standard bell curve, the Gaussian distribution, that's a Mediocristan tool. It works great for things like height or measurement errors where things bunch up around the average.
Right.
But as the source points out, mathematicians like Mandelbrot showed decades ago, it just doesn't fit financial markets, doesn't fit Extremistan. Applying a bell curve there, well, it massively underestimates the chance and the impact of those extreme events.
Like banks collapsing because their risk models basically said huge losses were impossible.
Precisely that. The source is really critical of this ubiquity of the Gaussian problem. It argues it was a key factor in huge financial messes, like the LTCM collapse in 1998 and even earlier bank failures. It's like applying models based on, well, the source calls them phony premises or imaginary worlds, to a reality they just don't describe. It's like having a perfect theory for a frictionless sphere and then being shocked when a real lumpy apple doesn't roll the same way. The source kind of dismisses needing complex math to explain why the world doesn't fit. Simple models just says, theory schmeary.
Okay, but it's not just the math, right? A lot of this failure seems to come down to how our own brains are wired. What are some of the cognitive biases the sources point to that really trip us up when we face uncertainty?
Oh yeah. A major one is what this source calls the narrative fallacy. We are basically storytelling machines. We crave explanations for everything, so we construct these narratives after something happens to convince ourselves we understand the past. Even if the links we make are way too simple or sometimes just plain wrong, the source mentions journalists all converging on the same easy explanation or making up reasons for things like the roaring 80s.
Or blaming everything on someone's nationality.
Right. Using nationality as a kind of lazy catch-all, even though studies show things like sex, class, or profession are much better predictors of how someone might behave. We love a good story, nothing wrong with that. But the problem is we rarely check the logic of the story itself. We just check if the individual facts seem right.
And then there's confirmation bias.
Yep. Once we have a view of the world, we become absolute experts at finding evidence that confirms it and totally ignoring anything that contradicts it. The source points out how different groups, say Arabs and Israelis, or Democrats and Republicans, can look at the very same data and see completely different stories that just happen to perfectly confirm their existing beliefs.
And more information doesn't necessarily help.
That's the paradox. The source says more information can actually make you more confident in your wrong view because you just find more snippets to support it, not less confident.
Okay, and what about the stuff we don't see? The hidden information, the silent evidence.
Ah, silent evidence. This is maybe one of the most powerful and sobering concepts. We only ever hear from the survivors. The source uses that really poignant example of drowned worshipers. They don't write histories about why their prayers didn't work. You only hear from the ones who prayed and happened to survive for other reasons.
Wow.
You see this everywhere, in business, right? We study successful companies, try to copy them, but we completely ignore the massive graveyard of failed companies that had basically the same characteristics and maybe even better plans, but just got unlucky. We end up misattributing success purely to skill.
Like that Casanova example, attributing his survival to destiny, not just luck.
Exactly. He survived a bunch of crazy situations, so he felt destiny guided him. But he was just one guy in a whole cohort of adventurers taking wild risks. Statistically, someone was bound to survive to win the lottery ticket of survival. It's pure selection bias.
Like the swimmer's body thing, too.
Yeah, that's another great illustration in the sources. We see people with swimmers' bodies, assume swimming gives you that body.
Yeah.
But maybe those are just the people who were naturally built that way, and so they stuck with swimming, while others dropped out. We confuse the cause and effect because we only see the successful outcome. The silent evidence of the dropouts is gone.
It really sounds like on top of all these specific biases, we just naturally think we know a lot more than we actually do.
That's what the source calls epistemic arrogance. We consistently overestimate our knowledge, our understanding, our ability to predict. It cites those funny but telling stats, like over 94% of Swedes think they're in the top 50% of drivers. 84% of Frenchmen feel the same about their lovemaking skill.
Chuckle slightly.
Yeah.
And we do it with planning, too. We constantly underestimate how long tasks will take, how much they'll cost, especially if it's something new. Because we focus only on the known bits we can plan for and completely ignore the cloud of unknown unknowns. The things we don't even know we don't know.
Even spreadsheets make it worse.
Yeah, the source argues that spreadsheet programs can actually feed this arrogance. They make forecasts look so easy, so linear, so precise. This leads to armies of forecasters who, the source somewhat cheekily suggests, might be even less effective than Soviet central planners.
Ouch. And this ties into domain specificity. The idea that our smarts in one area don't automatically carry over. Exactly. Our knowledge and even our critical thinking skills often get stuck in one context. They don't automatically transfer. The source gives examples like, someone being book smart, high SAT scores, but still irrationally afraid of strangers. Or the visual absurdity of someone taking an escalator up to the gym, to use the Stairmaster.
Right, right.
Our brain isn't like one central computer applying logic everywhere. We seem to use different mental tools, different machinery in different situations.
Mm.
And the source points out this can be particularly dangerous with, say, philosophers, people we expect to be watchdogs of critical thinking. They might be incredibly rigorous about abstract academic debates, but completely leave that critical thinking behind when dealing with real-world uncertainty.
Okay, so it's not just our brains messing up. The actual systems and tools we use for prediction, they seem fundamentally flawed too, especially when we try to apply them to complex modern life.
Absolutely. A really core problem the sources highlight is just ignoring variability. A forecast that only gives you an average number is almost useless, maybe even dangerous, for planning. As the source puts it, you don't cross a river just because it's 4 feet deep on average. You need to know the range. Could it be 10 feet deep in places? Ignoring that range, that variability, is a fundamental error, and it stems directly from confusing Mediocristan, where averages work okay, with Extremistan, where they don't.
And that leads to using the wrong models.
Right. Applying models designed for simple, predictable, linear systems to wildly complex, nonlinear ones where things can explode or collapse unpredictably. The source is pretty scathing about standard financial models, arguing they're built on these assumptions of smooth, continuous changes that just don't reflect messy reality. This is where ideas from chaos theory become relevant. Tiny changes in starting conditions can lead to massively different, unpredictable outcomes down the line.
The butterfly effect.
Exactly. Using models that just assume away these nonlinearities. The source says that's like ignoring a mammoth standing right in front of you while you're busy worrying about tiny subatomic particles. You're missing the biggest risk.
And the sources mention this isn't just a finance problem, right? Climate change models face similar issues.
Yes, they do. Complex feedback loops, high sensitivity to initial inputs. It makes long-range prediction incredibly difficult. Small tweaks in the model can lead to wildly different projections decades out. The source also connects increased globalization not just to economic benefits, but also to increased risks, like the rapid spread of diseases or financial contagion, or even just fads. Because everything is so interconnected, nonlinear effects can ripple through the system much faster.
And this ties into Hayek's ideas about central planning.
Yeah, the sources bring up Hayek's critique, the idea that we overestimate our ability to understand and manage complex social systems just based on scientific-style knowledge. What Hayek calls scientism, or the source calls nerd knowledge, is a form of what Thailand calls Platonicity. That's the mistake of thinking our neat theories and categories perfectly map onto messy reality. Real knowledge, Hayek argued, is distributed throughout society. The system as a whole processes information organically, often much better than any single planner trying to gather all the data and dictate outcomes.
So it feels like we're always trying to work backward. We see a complex outcome, and we try to figure out the simple rules that caused it. But maybe that's just impossible in these really complex Extremistan type systems.
That's exactly the inverse problem, as the sources describe it. It's incredibly hard, maybe impossible, to figure out the precise starting conditions, the ice cube, just by looking at the final outcome, the puddle. Especially when chance and nonlinearity are involved, so many different starting points, so many different sequences of events could lead to the exact same result we observe right now. We constantly confuse the arrow of logic that goes from theory to reality with the much harder task of figuring out the theory from reality.
We don't see the probability distribution itself.
No, we just see the events, one sequence. And the source stresses that plenty of different underlying probability distributions could have generated that exact same sequence of events we saw.
Okay, so wow. What does this all mean then? If prediction is this flawed and our biases are actively working against us and even our best tools are often the wrong ones for the job, how do we even operate? How do we make decisions in the world?
That's the critical question the sources really grapple with. How do we make decisions when we fundamentally can't predict? The classic illustration they use is the turkey problem.
The turkey.
Yeah. Imagine you're a turkey. Every day for 1,000 days, the farmer feeds you. That past data overwhelmingly confirms safety, right? The farmer is nice. But that same data is also perfectly consistent with the farmer fattening you up for Thanksgiving. The exact same past evidence can justify completely opposite future expectations.
Okay, yeah, I see.
The source argues that the number of possible future deviations from the past trend is basically infinite. This gets at Nelson Goodman's philosophical riddle of induction. So the key takeaway here is, often you have to learn to make decisions without relying on a perfect prediction or a grand theory.
Okay, so we know prediction is hard, maybe impossible for the big stuff. Biases are everywhere. The world is wild. So, based on these sources, what can we actually do? How do we navigate this Extremistan place effectively?
Well, one really key strategy drawn from Pascal's wager is to shift your focus. Focus on the consequences of an event, not the probability. Especially for those rare big events. We often can't reliably calculate the odds of a black swan happening. The probability is fuzzy, maybe even unknowable. But we can often imagine the impact, the effect, if it does happen. The source uses the earthquake example. You don't know the exact odds of a huge one hitting San Francisco next year, but you can definitely imagine the devastating consequences.
Right.
So a lot of the philosophy in the source material boils down to this. Make decisions by weighing the potential outcomes, the consequences, rather than getting bogged down trying to pinpoint unknowable likelihood.
Instead of asking, how likely is this market crash? You should be asking, okay, what happens to me if this market crashes? Is my portfolio wiped out or just dented?
Precisely. And directly related to that, the sources strongly suggest prioritizing preparedness over prediction. It's interesting. The source suggests military thinkers, maybe contrary to movie portrayals, often get this better than some academics or corporate executives who are playing with other people's money. You can't predict every specific threat, every enemy tactic, but you can build robust systems, flexible plans, well-trained units that can withstand a wide range of shocks.
Invest in resilience, not crystal balls.
Exactly. The argument is put your resources into being able to handle surprises, rather than pouring ever more money into trying to refine predictions that are likely to remain flawed for the really big events. Infinite vigilance isn't possible anyway.
Okay, now here's where it gets really practical, I think. The barbell strategy. This seems like a core technique from the sources for actually handling risk when you accept you can't predict Extremistan outcomes.
It absolutely is. The barbell strategy is all about avoiding the murky middle ground. Instead of putting your assets in supposed medium-risk investments, which the source argues is often where the hidden, misunderstood black swan risk lies anyway, you go to the extremes. You put the vast majority of your resources, say, the source suggests maybe 85–90%, into extremely safe things, like treasury bills described as about as safe a class of instruments as you can manage to find on this planet. Maximum safety. Minimum risk.
Okay, the safe end of the barbell.
Right. Then you take the small remaining portion, maybe 10–15%, and put it into extremely speculative things. Things with huge potential upside. Highly leveraged options, venture capital style bets, things where you could lose it all, but you could also gain massively.
So you've got a solid, safe floor protecting most of your wealth, but you still have exposure to those potentially huge positive black swans with the small, risky part.
That's the beauty of it. Your maximum downside is capped. You can only lose that small 10–15% speculative chunk. But your potential upside is potentially unlimited, or at least very, very large. It's what the source calls a convex strategy. You benefit much more from positive surprises than you lose from negative ones.
And this isn't just for money, right?
No, the source applies the principle much more broadly. It sees it in career choices, maybe having a very stable, boring day job, the safe part, combined with a wildly speculative artistic side project, the risky part. Even in political systems, contrasting stable, predictable dictatorships with volatile, messy, but perhaps ultimately more adaptable democracies like Italy, which the source sees as fragile but potentially resilient due to constant small failures.
Okay, so limit the negative black swans with the barbell. But then there's the flip side, actively exposing yourself to positive ones. How do you do that? Opportunity seems so random.
They're random, often. But the sources argue you can increase your exposure to potential good luck. Opportunities are rare, yes, but you need to maximize your chances of stumbling upon them.
How? Just hang around more.
Kind of. The sources talk about collecting free non-lottery tickets. These are situations or activities with potentially unlimited upside but very limited downside or cost. This means being open to serendipity, to chance encounters. The source literally advises being available like, cancel your existing plans if a potentially huge, unexpected opportunity pops up. Don't be rigidly scheduled.
Be interruptible.
Yes. And it means putting yourself in environments where serendipity is more likely to happen. Like the source argues, big cities generally offer more chances for random productive encounters than quiet suburbs, even with great internet access. Go to parties, go to conferences, talk to strangers. Casual discussions can lead to unexpected breakthroughs.
Luck favors the prepared mind, as Pasteur said.
Exactly. That quote is in the source material. Being prepared means being exposed, being available, being open. That increases your odds of benefiting from those happy accidents, those positive black swans.
It also sounds like just managing our own psychology is a big piece of this puzzle. The sources mention something about happiness, coming from frequent small good things rather than one big win.
They do. It touches on hedonic psychology. Our overall sense of happiness seems to be more affected by the frequency of positive experiences, not necessarily the intensity of one huge one. The source notes that making, say, $1 million in 1 year and then nothing for the next 9 isn't actually as pleasurable moment to moment as making a steady $100,000 every year for 10 years. Lots of small positive boosts are better than one giant one followed by a long drought.
And the reverse is true for negative things.
Yes, conversely, repeated small negative stressors. The source uses the analogy of Chinese water torture from continuous small losses, like a trader experiencing a slow bleed, can be far more psychologically damaging, even physically affecting parts of the brain, than one single large, rare shock.
So those little daily hassles really do add up.
They do. And the source argues these constant small stresses don't actually strengthen you, contrary to that popular what doesn't kill you idea. The sources suggest they just weaken you, wear you down.
Okay, one more strategy that seems counterintuitive. Sometimes, maybe the best approach in this complex world is to just do nothing.
Yes, the sources discuss the concept of iatrogenics. That's harm caused by the healer, by the intervention itself. Historically, in medicine, doctors sometimes made things worse or even killed patients by intervening aggressively when letting the body heal itself might have been better. There's often a strong bias towards action, towards intervening, even when our understanding of a complex system, whether it's a human body or an economy, is really incomplete.
We feel like we have to do something.
Exactly. It raises a really important question. How much harm do we inadvertently cause in society, in the economy, by constantly trying to fix or stabilize complex systems we don't fully grasp? The source is particularly critical of government efforts to smooth out the business cycle, for example. It argues that preventing small recessions can actually build up hidden fragilities, making the system more vulnerable to a much bigger catastrophic collapse later on. Like the 2008 crisis, which the source frames not as a true, unpredictable black swan, but as the inevitable consequence of fragility built up over years of misguided intervention based on ignorance of the real risks. Sometimes, maybe letting things break in smaller ways allows the system to adapt and become more robust in the long run.
Okay, so bringing this all together, what does this mean for you listening right now? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think it means fundamentally recognizing the limits of prediction, especially in those scalable, extremistan parts of life, your career, your investments, maybe even major life choices. It means being deeply, deeply skeptical of overly neat narratives and confident forecasts from experts. Acknowledge your own built-in cognitive biases, that tendency toward confirmation bias, the blindness to silent evidence, and crucially, it means proactively structuring your life, your finances, your decisions to be robust to the negative surprises you know you can't predict, while at the same time being actively open and exposed to the positive surprises you also can't predict.
So be a fool sometimes, but not when it really matters.
Kind of, yeah. The sources suggest you could afford some epistemic arrogance for small stuff, where the consequences of being wrong are minor. Be human, have opinions, make casual predictions about things that don't have huge stakes. But for the big important decisions, the ones operating in Extremistan, where the cumulative damage from being wrong about one big thing dwarfs being right about lots of small things, that's where you need rigorous skepticism. That's where strategies like the barbell approach become essential. And it also means looking beyond the immediate, visible actions of, say, governments or large organizations, what the source sometimes calls phony philanthropy, if it's just for show, and always trying to consider the unseen, potential negative second and third order consequences of interventions in complex systems. Applying Bastiat's old idea, what we see and what we don't see.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We've covered so much ground. Why the world is far, far less predictable than we like to think. Why our own brains often fight against accepting that reality, using biases like the narrative fallacy and ignoring silent evidence. And crucially, some really surprising ways to navigate all that uncertainty by understanding the difference between Mediocristan and Extremistan.
Yeah, we've seen how confusing those different types of randomness, relying on flawed models like the Gaussian bell curve when they just don't apply, and just generally succumbing to overconfidence can make us incredibly fragile, brittle, really, vulnerable to those black swans, those prediction errors.
But importantly, we've also learned about some powerful, if sometimes counterintuitive, strategies. Things like focusing on consequences over probabilities, that Pascal's wager idea. prioritizing preparedness and robustness over chasing predictions, adopting that barbell approach to manage risk, and actively seeking exposure to positive outliers, finding those free, non-lottery tickets.
Absolutely. I think this really challenges you, the listener, to think differently about information itself, to be much more skeptical of expertise, especially when it's based on models that demonstrably ignore the mammoth of real-world unpredictability. And ultimately, to fundamentally rethink how you approach planning and decision-making in your own life, especially when the stakes are high, or when you're dealing with situations that have those scalable extremistan-type outcomes.
So let's leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. Building on everything we've discussed from the sources, the limits of prediction, our inherent biases, the inverse problem, the sheer opacity of reality. Here it is. If our models are fundamentally flawed, if our brains are wired to mislead us, and if the events that matter most are inherently unpredictable, then perhaps the deepest form of practical knowledge isn't about knowing the future or having some perfect theory of how things should work. Perhaps it's about truly deeply understanding the sheer vastness of what we don't know and what we can't know, and then building our lives, our systems, our strategies with the robustness needed to deal with that fundamental uncertainty.